If you think you've already heard bizarre stories about medieval kings, it's because you haven't yet heard the story of Edward II. We're talking about a man who was born to rule, but was called weak, ridiculed by his own nobles, and who may have died assassinated in such a cruel way that even today it sends shivers down the spines of those who read the accounts. But what few people know is that it all began long before blood was spilled. It started with a boy who, instead of dreaming of swords and conquests, only wanted to feel cold water running between his fingers. And believe it or not, understanding this detail completely changes the way you think about Edward II's tragic downfall. It was on a freezing night, in the vast castle of Carnarvon, that the fragile cry of a newborn echoed through the stone corridors. It was April 25, 1284, the day Edward was born, son of Edward I, the king known as the Hammer of the Scots, one of England's most feared monarchs. To his father, that son was supposed to be the living continuation of his legacy, a king with a sword in hand, capable of crushing rebellions and expanding borders. But Edward II was never any of that. While medieval princes were used to wearing heavy armor from a young age, training hunting falcons, and wielding swords, young Edward preferred things that seemed far too simple for a future king. He loved swimming in cold lakes, rowing boats until his arms ached, spending hours fishing in silence. He had an almost hypnotic fascination with wood, tools, ropes, nails. He took pleasure in crafting objects, hammering pieces, sewing sails for boats. Can you imagine Edward I's disappointment, seeing the heir to the crown prefer hammering planks instead of training with knights? To the father, all of this was a sign of weakness, an unforgivable weakness in a prince who, one day, would have to rule men hungry for war. And that's where the chasm between father and son began to grow. While the king dedicated himself to military campaigns, tracing maps of conquest, Edward II grew more and more distant, immersed in worlds of water and wood. He seemed as far removed from the battlefields as a fisherman on a misty morning. Few records of Edward II's childhood have survived, but the little we know reveals something important. He never fit the brutal mold his father wanted to shape, and that different, almost gentle nature would become Edward II's greatest weakness and his greatest tragedy, because someone was about to appear in his life, someone who would fill the void left by his father's coldness, but who, at the same time, would drag the young prince into the center of a scandal so massive that it nearly imploded the English throne. But who was the man who entered Edward II's life, and who, simply by existing at his side, changed the destiny of an entire kingdom? His name was Piers Gaveston, a young Gascon knight, son of a modest nobleman from southern France, who appeared at the English court at a very young age to serve Prince Edward. And from the very beginning, something between the two seemed different. Edward II, starved for affection, found in Gaveston not merely a companion for hunting, banquets, and tournaments, but someone who seemed to truly see and understand him, while the rest of the court looked at Edward II with a certain reservation or disdain. Gaveston laughed with him, shared confidences, and exchanged private jokes. Some chroniclers would later describe their friendship as having an almost magnetic intensity. Have you ever had someone so close that just the presence of that person seemed to make the whole world fall silent? For Edward II, Piers Gaveston became that person, a refuge, an ally against the suffocating weight of royal expectations. But there was one huge problem. Edward II's father, the powerful Edward I, did not like what he was seeing. A stern, suspicious man obsessed with keeping power under control, Edward I soon began to see Gaveston as a threat. After all, the young Gascon had the attention and the heart of the prince. And for the old king, that meant an insult and a significant political danger. The risk wasn't only emotional. The king feared that Gaveston would influence decisions, become involved in conspiracies, or use Edward II as a puppet. And so he ordered Gaveston's exile. But instead of distancing himself, Edward II became even more stubborn. He even begged for his friend's return and, unsatisfied, proposed something that made his father furious. He wanted to grant Piers Gaveston a noble title. For the court, this was a monumental scandal. A young foreigner with no royal blood, elevated to nobility, an outrage. a sign of blatant favoritism. And here begins the great mystery that still intrigues historians today. Was it merely friendship? Or was there something more between Edward II and Gaveston? The entire court whispered about the possibility. Rumors spread through the stone corridors. Their relationship included affectionate gestures, extravagant gifts, absurd privileges. Some chroniclers of the time, especially the more moralistic ones, described their connection as inappropriate. But they were never able to prove anything beyond intense affection. Perhaps it was simply the deepest friendship a king ever had. Or perhaps it was a forbidden love, hidden beneath silk robes and secret codes. No one knows for certain. But one thing is undeniable. The presence of Piers Gaveston at Edward II's side planted the seeds of chaos. And when the throne finally became vacant, Edward II wasted no time doing what his father had always feared. In the summer of 1307, Edward I, the king as hard as stone, the conqueror who terrified the Scots, died, and as soon as his father closed his eyes, Edward II turned the tables. His first order as king was to bring Piers Gaveston back from exile. For Edward II, it was like reclaiming a piece of himself. For the court, it was the beginning of a scandal. But Edward II didn't stop there. He didn't merely welcome Gaveston back to court. He granted him the title of Earl of Cornwall. It may seem like a small detail, but it wasn't. The title of Earl of Cornwall at that time was one of the highest in the kingdom, reserved almost exclusively for the royal family. To give that to a young Gascon knight with no noble blood was like tearing up the protocol in front of all the English nobility. Can you imagine the expressions on the faces of the lords, barons, and dukes as they watched Gaveston parade around with a title that should have belonged to royal blood? But Edward II wanted even more. During his own coronation, he allowed Gaveston to carry the crown of Saint Edward. Yes, the very same crown of Saint Edward that is still used today in sacred coronation ceremonies, the supreme symbol of English royal power. For the nobility, this was yet another deep affront. And each of Edward II's gestures was like stirring up a hornet's nest. The great nobles of the realm began to whisper, conspire, and meet in secret. To them, the king was losing his mind, granting royal privileges to a single man. All because of a relationship whose true nature no one dared to say aloud. And amid this political chaos, Edward II had another kingly duty to fulfill: marriage. But not even marriage was able to save him. In fact, it turned into yet another step toward his ruin. In January 1308, Edward II sealed one of the most significant political alliances of medieval Europe. He married Isabella of France, daughter of King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair. It was a marriage intended to solidify ties between France and England, strengthen diplomacy, and perhaps calm the political turbulence beginning to boil over in the English court. But from the very first day, everything went wrong. During the celebrations, Isabella was practically ignored. Edward II seemed utterly uninterested in his wife, while the queen should have been the star of the festivities. The king could not take his eyes, or his attention, off Gaveston. Edward showered Gaveston with lavish gifts, lands, jewels, and horses. His favoritism was blatantly obvious to the entire court, and Isabella, humiliated, was relegated to the background on her own wedding day. Can you imagine how enormous the embarrassment must have been? It was almost as if the king were shouting to the world that his true heart belonged to another man. Isabella, the daughter of a king as proud and powerful as Philip IV, would not forget this affront, nor would the English nobles. In 1312, the leading nobles of the realm united to put an end to what they saw as the greatest scandal of Edward's reign. They captured Gaveston. Edward II tried desperately to negotiate. He offered lands, titles, concessions, but it was too late. Piers Gaveston was taken to Blacklow Hill and executed without mercy. Some accounts say he was beheaded right there, while the king's messengers pleaded for his life. Imagine Edward II's despair upon learning that the man he loved most, or at least trusted the most, had been killed like a common criminal. Gaveston's death left the king devastated, but if anyone thought Edward II would learn his lesson, they were wrong, because the void left by Gaveston was soon filled by the Despensers. After 1312, Hugh Despenser the Younger began to win the king's absolute trust, and if Gaveston had been considered a scandal, the Despensers turned out to be an absolute disaster. Hugh Despenser monopolized favors, lands, fortunes. He persecuted rivals, confiscated properties, and ordered the imprisonment of anyone who dared challenge him. England fell under the control of a single ambitious family. The entire nobility seethed with hatred. But the chaos didn't stop there, because in 1314, King Edward II decided to face Scotland, attempting to recover the political prestige that was crumbling in London. On the plains of Bannockburn, he marched against Robert the Bruce, confident of a crushing victory. But what happened was an epic disaster. Robert the Bruce used the terrain, the marshes, and set perfect ambushes. The English knights got bogged down, the infantry became easy targets. Edward II was forced to flee, nearly captured. Bannockburn was more than a military defeat. It was a fatal blow to the king's prestige. England returned even more humiliated, and Isabella began thinking of her own plans. But who could have imagined that the woman ignored at her own wedding would become the greatest force against her own husband? For it was Isabella who, in secret, began to plot the downfall of Edward II. For years, Isabella of France remained discreet. She observed the court, accumulated humiliations, and watched her husband lose himself among favorites, scandals, and defeats. But while the king sank deeper into political crises, Isabella began to see the true enemies of the throne, the Despensers. She knew that Hugh Despenser the Younger and his father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, had monopolized land, power, and the very mind of the king, and that all of England despised them. That's when Isabella decided to act. In 1325, the kingdom was on the brink of a new war with France. Edward II needed someone to negotiate peace. And who better to lead those talks than the daughter of the French king? Isabella was sent to France on a diplomatic mission, but once on French soil, she never returned. There, far from her husband's watchful eyes, Isabella joined forces with Roger Mortimer, a powerful English nobleman who had been exiled precisely for opposing the Despensers' domination. Mortimer was everything Isabella needed: cunning, charismatic, and well-connected among discontented nobles. Together, they began to plan something no one dared even whisper: the overthrow of the king. Can you imagine the Queen of England plotting against her own husband on foreign soil, while Edward II waited for his wife's return? Isabella was organizing troops, forging alliances, and gathering resources to invade her own kingdom. And in September 1326, Isabella returned to England. But she did not return alone. Accompanied by Roger Mortimer and a small army, she was welcomed as a liberator. Everywhere they passed, cities and nobles opened their gates. The image of Isabella, the humiliated queen, now leading an invasion, inspired a wave of popular and noble support. Edward II and the Despensers panicked. They tried to flee westward, seeking refuge in loyal castles, but Isabella's allies moved swiftly. Soon afterward, Edward II was captured, and Hugh Despenser the Younger met a brutal fate. He was swiftly tried, declared a traitor, and executed in a barbaric fashion. Chroniclers report that he was dragged through the streets, hanged, and eviscerated while still alive. His body was then quartered, and the parts displayed in several English cities as a warning to any noble who might dare stand between the people and justice. But for Edward II, the nightmare was only beginning. Even after being captured, Edward II still posed a danger: the simple fact that he was alive. And for those who had overthrown him, that was intolerable. What happened to him next plunged English history into one of its greatest medieval mysteries. In January 1327, under intense political pressure, Edward II was forced to abdicate. He signed documents passing the crown to his young son, Edward III, then just 15 years old. That's a topic for another video, but incredibly, even at such a young age, Edward III managed to restore royal authority after his father's disastrous reign and went on to transform the Kingdom of England into one of Europe's greatest military powers. After his abdication, Edward II was taken to Berkeley Castle, where he was placed under the custody of Thomas de Berkeley and John Maltravers, men tied to the new regime of Isabella and Mortimer. At first, his imprisonment seemed almost respectful. He had decent accommodations, adequate food, and some comfort, but all of that changed, and quickly. Isabella and Mortimer knew that as long as Edward II remained alive, he would be a symbol for rebellions, so they began to break his spirit. Isolated, the king was kept away from any true news. He received fake letters telling him he had been forgotten, betrayed, or that his son wanted nothing to do with him. He endured hunger, cold, and days on end without seeing anyone. It was pure psychological torture. The objective was clear: to make Edward II give up on living, but he remained alive. And then, on the night of September 21st, 1327, something dark happened. Some say that Edward II was murdered in a manner so cruel that it still makes people shudder just to hear the story. According to the most macabre version, assassins inserted a horn tube into the king's anus and, through it, pushed in a red-hot iron rod. The goal? To burn his internal organs without leaving external marks, thus simulating a natural death. But did it really happen that way? Other accounts claim that Edward II might have been smothered with pillows, or perhaps poisoned. To this day, no one is absolutely certain how or even if Edward II truly died that night. The official cause recorded in the royal documents was simply a terse phrase: natural death. Natural? A king imprisoned and isolated in a castle guarded by men loyal to his enemies. And this is where the greatest mystery of this story begins. Because, 10 years later, a letter emerged that would cast doubt on everything the world believed about the king's death. Around 1337, a letter surfaced written by Manuel Fieschi, a Genoese priest. Its contents completely changed the course of this history. In the letter, Fieschi claimed that Edward II had not been murdered. According to the priest, the former king had managed to escape from Berkeley, aided by loyal men. He supposedly fled along the English coast, crossed into France, and ended up in Italy, living as a hermit, repentant for his mistakes. Few people know this part of the story. But this letter really exists, and no one has been able to prove it definitively true or false. Some historians believe that Isabella and Mortimer staged Edward II's death to avoid creating a political martyr. After all, keeping him alive in secret would be safer than executing him brutally. Other historians, however, believe that Fieschi's letter was a fabrication designed to destabilize the reign of Edward III. After all, just a rumor that the former king was still alive could spark civil wars and disputes over the throne. The doubt lingers to this day. Meanwhile, in Gloucester, Edward II's tomb has become a place of pilgrimage. But even there, the mystery hangs over it. Is his body truly inside, or was someone else buried in his place? While the Real King spent his final days in silence, far from England, the reign of Edward II was marked by scandals, betrayals, and emotional vulnerability. For some historians, Edward II was a man ahead of his time. Someone who didn't hide his emotions and broke the brutal rigidity of medieval monarchy. For others, he was simply an incompetent king, unable to rule in a violent world that demanded strength and blood. But one thing is certain: his downfall set a very dangerous precedent. The idea that a king could be deposed began to haunt all English monarchs from that moment on. The kingdom's politics grew more unstable, conspiracies more bloody, and the throne increasingly vulnerable. Edward II's son, Edward III, ascended to power determined to restore the monarchy's honor. In 1330, he condemned Mortimer to execution for treason and sent his own mother, Isabella, to live confined in a convent. It was the young king's way of saying, "Whoever meddles with the crown pays dearly." Now I want to know your opinion. Do you believe that Edward II was truly murdered in such a cruel way? Or do you believe that he managed to escape and lived secretly until the end of his days? Leave your opinion here in the comments. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you'd like YouTube to recommend more videos like this one, and to discover the story of the king who was devoured alive in his own castle. Click on the screen and check it out.